The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned airfield as Marcus wiped the sweat from his forehead. For the past 3 years, he had arrived at this forgotten place every single day at exactly 6 a.m., carrying his bucket of soapy water, clean rags, and polishing cloths. The other workers at the nearby construction site thought he was crazy. Why would anyone spend hours cleaning an old military plane that would never fly again? The aircraft sat alone on the cracked concrete runway, its once proud silver body now dulled by years of neglect. Most people saw only rust and decay, but Marcus saw something different. He saw the sleek lines of a machine that had once soared through clouds, the powerful engines that had carried brave souls across dangerous skies, and the history that lived within every rivet and panel. Marcus worked methodically, starting with the nose of the plane and moving slowly toward the tail. He scrubbed away dirt and grime that had accumulated over decades of abandonment. The work was hard and lonely, but it gave him peace. While others rushed to their jobs in the busy city nearby, Marcus found solace in this quiet ritual. The locals in the small town of Millbrook had grown accustomed to seeing the tall, quiet man walking toward the airfield each morning. Some whispered that he was a veteran who had lost his mind. Others believed he was just an odd fellow with too much time on his hands. The truth was that nobody really knew Marcus well enough to understand why he did what he did. At the local diner where Marcus ate lunch every day, the waitress, Sarah, often tried to make conversation. She had noticed that despite his rough appearance and calloused hands, there was something gentle about the way he spoke and moved. Marcus was always polite, always said please and thank you, and never caused trouble. But when people asked about his past, or why he spent so much time at the airfield, he would simply smile and change the subject. The plane Marcus cared for was a Douglas A-26 Invader, a twin-engine bomber from World War II. Most people walking past wouldn't know what type of aircraft it was, but Marcus knew every detail. He knew that these planes had flown dangerous missions over enemy territory. He knew about the brave crews who had risked their lives in machines just like this one. And he knew something else that nobody in Millbrook suspected. As the weeks turned into months, and months into years, Marcus's dedication never wavered. Rain or shine, hot summer days or cold winter mornings, he was always there. The plane slowly began to transform under his careful attention. The metal started to gleam again, the windows became clear, and even the old propeller blades began to shine. Word of the strange man and his obsession with the old plane eventually reached the ears of people beyond Millbrook. Aviation enthusiasts started making trips to see the restored aircraft. Some offered to buy it, others wanted to move it to a museum, but the town council wasn't interested in selling. The plane had become something of a local landmark, and Marcus had become its unofficial guardian. One particularly hot summer day, Marcus noticed a black sedan pull up near the airfield fence. A man in an expensive suit stepped out and stood watching from a distance. This wasn't unusual anymore, as curious visitors often came to see the plane, but something about this man felt different. He didn't take pictures like the tourists did. He didn't walk around examining the aircraft from different angles like the aviation enthusiasts. He simply stood and watched Marcus work, his face serious and thoughtful. The man returned several times over the next few weeks, always watching quietly from the same spot by the fence. Marcus tried to ignore him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this observer was different from all the others. There was something familiar about the way the man carried himself, something that made Marcus's hands tremble slightly as he polished the plane's wings. Marcus had spent years trying to forget certain parts of his past, burying painful memories beneath the daily routine of caring for the aircraft. The work had become his therapy, his way of making peace with things he couldn't change. But now, with this mysterious observer watching his every move, old feelings began to stir. Memories that had been carefully locked away started pushing at the edges of his consciousness. One morning, Marcus arrived at the airfield to find the man waiting for him instead of hiding behind the fence. He was older than Marcus had realized, probably in his 70s, with silver hair and keen blue eyes that seemed to see everything. The man wore a different expression now, not just curious but intensely focused, as if he was studying Marcus rather than the plane. Marcus felt his heart rate increase as he approached with his cleaning supplies. Something about this encounter felt inevitable, like a moment he had been both dreading and expecting for years. The careful, quiet life he had built in Millbrook suddenly seemed fragile, as if it might crumble under the weight of whatever this stranger had come to say. The man stepped forward as Marcus reached the plane, his movements deliberate and confident. There was authority in his posture, the kind that comes from years of being in command. Marcus set down his bucket and straightened up, meeting the stranger's gaze for the first time. In that moment of eye contact, something passed between them, a recognition that went deeper than simple memory. Marcus knew that his peaceful days of anonymously caring for the old plane were about to end. Whatever this man wanted, whatever he knew or suspected, it would change everything. The secret that Marcus had carried for so many years, the reason he felt compelled to honor this particular aircraft with such devotion, was about to be revealed, and there was nowhere left to run. The stranger extended his hand toward Marcus, and when he spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "General Robert Hayes, United States Air Force, retired," he said simply. "And you must be Lieutenant Marcus Thompson, though I suppose it's been a long time since anyone called you that." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. Nobody in Millbrook knew his real last name, and certainly nobody knew about his military rank. He had been living under an assumed identity for over 2 decades, working construction jobs and keeping to himself. The name Thompson belonged to a different life, a different man who had made choices that still haunted his dreams. General Hayes studied Marcus's reaction with the patience of someone who had interrogated many men over the course of his career. "I've been looking for you for 23 years, Lieutenant. When I heard about a man obsessively caring for an old A-26 in a small town in Kansas, I had to investigate. There aren't many people who would know how to properly maintain one of these birds, especially not with the kind of attention to detail I've been told you show." Marcus wiped his palms on his work clothes, his mind racing. He had always known this day might come, but as the years passed, he had allowed himself to believe that his past was truly buried. "I don't know what you're talking about, sir," he said quietly, though both men knew the denial was meaningless. The general walked slowly around the aircraft, running his hand along the polished metal surfaces. "This is beautiful work, Lieutenant. She looks better now than she did when she rolled off the production line in 1944. But then you always did have a special relationship with these machines, didn't you?" Memories flooded back despite Marcus's efforts to suppress them. He remembered being 19 years old, fresh out of flight training, assigned to the 416th Bomb Group in England. He remembered the smell of aviation fuel, the roar of engines, and the weight of responsibility that came with being trusted to fly multi-million-dollar aircraft into combat zones. Most clearly, he remembered the mission that changed everything. General Hayes stopped walking and turned to face Marcus directly. "Operation Market Garden, September 1944. Your squadron was providing close air support for the paratroopers at Arnhem. Do you remember that day, Lieutenant?" Marcus closed his eyes, and suddenly he was 22 again, gripping the controls of his A-26 as anti-aircraft fire exploded around him. He could hear his bombardier calling out targets over the radio, could feel the plane shudder as they released their payload. But something had gone wrong that day, something that had torn his life apart and sent him running from everything he had ever known. "There was a school," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. "We thought it was abandoned. Intelligence said the Germans were using it as a supply depot. But when we made our bombing run, he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. General Hayes nodded grimly. 47 Dutch children and 6 teachers. The building had been converted to a temporary shelter for refugees fleeing the fighting. Our intelligence was wrong, catastrophically wrong. But you weren't supposed to know that, Lieutenant. That information was classified for decades. Marcus sank down onto an old wooden crate, the weight of the memory crushing down on him like a physical force. For over 20 years, he had carried the guilt of what he believed was his failure, his mistake that had cost innocent lives. He had deserted his unit 3 days after the mission, unable to face his fellow airmen or continue flying missions knowing what he had done. I found out about the children 2 days after the mission, Marcus said, his voice hollow. I overheard 2 officers talking about damage assessments. They didn't know I was listening. When I realized what we had hit, what I had done, I couldn't stay. I couldn't pretend to be a hero when I had murdered children. The general sat down on another crate, bringing himself to Marcus's eye level. His stern expression had softened somewhat, replaced by something that might have been understanding. You were following orders based on intelligence that was provided to you. The fault wasn't yours, son. It was mine. Marcus looked up in shock. General Hayes continued, his own voice now heavy with emotion. I was a colonel then, in charge of intelligence for your sector. I was the one who identified that building as a military target. I was the one who sent you and your crew to bomb what I believed was a German supply depot. The blood of those children is on my hands, not yours. The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. For over 2 decades, he had carried guilt that wasn't entirely his to bear. The man he had been running from all these years wasn't some faceless military tribunal or enemy seeking revenge. It was someone who shared the burden of that terrible day, someone who understood the weight of decisions made in the fog of war. Why? Marcus asked. Why have you been looking for me? Why now? General Hayes stood up and walked to the plane's cockpit, peering through the clear glass that Marcus had polished countless times. Because 3 years ago, I was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. The doctors gave me 6 months, but I've managed to stretch it to 3 years through sheer stubbornness. I wanted to find you before I died, to tell you the truth about that day, and to ask for your forgiveness. Marcus felt tears welling up in his eyes, the first he had allowed himself to shed in years. Forgiveness? General, I'm the one who deserted. I'm the one who ran away instead of facing what we had done. I should be asking for your forgiveness. The general turned back to face him, and Marcus could see that the older man's eyes were also wet. We both made choices that day that we've had to live with. You chose to carry the guilt and disappear rather than let the military cover up the incident and pretend it never happened. I chose to stay and climb the ranks, telling myself that I could prevent similar mistakes in the future. Neither of us handled it perfectly, but we both paid a price. As the 2 men stood in the shadow of the restored aircraft, Marcus felt something shifting inside him. The shame and guilt that had driven him into hiding were still there, but they felt different now, shared rather than carried alone. The plane that had become his daily penance was no longer just a reminder of failure, but a symbol of the complexity of war, of good men forced to make impossible choices with incomplete information. General Hayes walked toward his car, then paused and looked back. I'm staying at the motel in town for a few days. There's more we need to talk about, Lieutenant. About that day, about what happened afterward, and about something I think you deserve to know about the families of those children. Will you meet me tomorrow? Marcus nodded, still overwhelmed by everything that had been revealed. As the general drove away, Marcus looked at the plane with new eyes. It was still the same aircraft he had been caring for, but now it represented something different. Instead of just guilt and penance, It had become a bridge between two men who had shared an unbearable burden for far too long. Marcus barely slept that night. He sat on the porch of his small rented house, staring at the stars and thinking about the conversation that had turned his world upside down. For the first time in 23 years, someone else knew the truth about who he was and what he had done. The secret that had isolated him from human connection was finally shared with another person who understood the weight of it. The next morning, Marcus found General Hayes waiting for him at their usual spot by the plane. The general looked tired, and Marcus could see signs of the illness that was slowly claiming his life. But his eyes were still sharp and alert as Marcus approached. "I brought something for you," General Hayes said, holding out a thick manila folder. "Information I've been collecting for years about the aftermath of that bombing mission. I thought you deserved to know what happened to the families." Marcus hesitated before taking the folder. Part of him was afraid to learn more details about the tragedy that had shaped his entire adult life. But another part of him knew that he needed to face the complete truth, no matter how painful it might be. Inside the folder were photographs, letters, and official documents spanning decades. There were pictures of the school before the bombing, showing children playing in the courtyard and teachers leading lessons. There were lists of the victims' names, ages, and brief biographical information about each child who had died. But as Marcus read deeper into the file, he discovered something unexpected. "General, this letter—" Marcus held up a document written in Dutch with an English translation attached. "It's from the parents of some of the children who died. They're thanking the Allied forces for liberating their country. They say they understood that their children's deaths were a terrible accident of war, not a deliberate act of cruelty." General Hayes nodded slowly. "I tracked down every family member I could find over the years. Many of them had similar feelings. They grieved their children terribly, but they also understood that war creates impossible situations. They blamed the Germans for occupying their country and using their children as human shields, not the Allied pilots who were trying to help liberate them." Marcus continued reading, his hands shaking as he absorbed letter after letter from families who had chosen forgiveness over hatred. One letter particularly stood out, written by a Dutch teacher who had lost her entire class in the bombing but had survived herself because she was sick that day. The teacher, named Elena Voss, had written, "To the airmen who bombed our school on September 19th, 1944, I hope this letter finds you and that you know we do not blame you for what happened. War is evil, and it forces good men to do terrible things they would never choose to do in peace. My students died, but their deaths were not meaningless if they helped end the occupation that was destroying our country. I pray that you can find peace and forgiveness for yourselves, because holding on to guilt will not bring back our children." Marcus wiped tears from his eyes as he finished reading. "She forgave us," he whispered. "Even after losing all her students, she forgave us." General Hayes reached into his jacket and pulled out another letter, this one more recent and written on different paper. "Elena Voss is still alive, Lieutenant. She's 94 years old and living in Amsterdam with her granddaughter. Last year, I contacted her and told her I had found the pilot who flew that mission. She asked me to give you this." With trembling hands, Marcus opened the letter dated just 6 months earlier. Elena's handwriting was shaky now, but her words were clear. "Dear Marcus Thompson, General Hayes told me your real name and that you have been carrying guilt for what happened at our school. I want you to know that I have thought of you and your crew many times over the years. I hoped you were living good lives and not torturing yourselves for something that was not your fault. Please come visit me if you can. I would like to meet the man who helped free my country and tell you in person that you are forgiven." Marcus couldn't speak for several minutes. The weight of guilt and shame that had crushed him for over 2 decades was beginning to lift, replaced by a different kind of pain, mixed with relief and gratitude. The victims' families had found peace decades ago, while he had been punishing himself in solitude. General Hayes sat quietly, allowing Marcus time to process the revelations. Finally, he spoke again. "There's one more thing, Lieutenant. The reason I really tracked you down wasn't just to share this information or to ask for forgiveness. I have a proposal for you." Marcus looked up from the letters, his mind still reeling from everything he had learned. "I've established a foundation," General Hayes continued, "dedicated to helping veterans deal with the moral injuries of war. Too many good soldiers come home carrying guilt for things they had to do in combat, things that weren't really their fault, but that society doesn't understand or know how to help them process. I want you to help me run it." The idea was overwhelming. Marcus had spent so long hiding from his military past that the thought of embracing it and helping others seemed impossible. "General, I'm not qualified for something like that. I deserted. I ran away instead of facing my responsibilities." General Hayes stood up and walked to the plane, placing his hand on the polished propeller. "Lieutenant, you've spent 23 years showing devotion to duty in the purest form possible. You've honored the memory of this aircraft and what it represents without any recognition, without any support, without anyone even knowing why you were doing it. You've demonstrated more dedication and moral courage than most soldiers ever show." Marcus joined the general beside the plane, looking at his reflection in the polished metal he had spent years perfecting. "What would happen to her?" he asked, gesturing toward the aircraft. "The Foundation wants to restore her to full flying condition and use her as a memorial to all the aircrew who served in World War II. We'll tell the story of what happened at Arnhem, the complete story including the tragedy and the forgiveness that followed. She'll become a symbol of healing, rather than just a monument to war." Over the following days, Marcus and General Hayes spent hours talking about the past, the present, and the future. They visited Elena Vos together, making the trip to Amsterdam where the elderly teacher embraced Marcus and told him in person that he was forgiven and that his guilt was unnecessary. They planned the Foundation's mission and discussed how to help other veterans find peace with the impossible choices war had forced them to make. 6 months later, Marcus stood beside the fully restored A-26 Invader as she prepared for her first flight in over 50 years. The plane gleamed in the morning sun, her engines running smoothly, ready to take to the sky once again. General Hayes had passed away 2 months earlier, but not before seeing his vision come to life. As the pilot Marcus had hired to fly the ceremonial first flight taxied down the runway, Marcus felt a profound sense of completion. The plane that had been his burden for so many years was now his mission. The guilt that had isolated him had been transformed into purpose. The secret shame that had defined his life had become a foundation for helping others find their own peace. The restored aircraft lifted gracefully into the sky, carrying with her the stories of all who had flown in planes like her, all who had made impossible choices in impossible circumstances, and all who had found the courage to forgive themselves and others. Marcus watched until she disappeared into the clouds, then walked back toward his new office where other veterans were waiting for help in finding their own paths to healing. The old plane had finally taught him her greatest lesson, that honor isn't about never making mistakes, but about how you choose to live with them and what you do to make things right.